Thank you for listening to the ThePPod from the Somerset Safeguarding Children Partnership. Please note, due to the nature of this podcast, themes relating to the abuse and neglect of children are discussed, with the content being designed for an adult audience for educational purposes in order to protect children from harm. Therefore, listener discretion is advised and the content unsuitable for children.
Welcome to the ThePPod.
Okay, welcome back to the ThePPod, the partnership podcast from the Somerset Safeguarding Children Partnership. Now, today's episode is very much focused on the trauma-informed network in Somerset, but also expanding out the understanding around that of the wider context of trauma-informed practice in general and across the whole of the Avon Somerset region. And there's been lots of work taking place from all agencies across the partnership, including the Avon Somerset Police, who have been sort of really driving this for a couple of years now and really looking to embed trauma-informed practice into all aspects of the work they do. Now, often when we think about supporting around trauma, we often think about supporting clients. But in terms of that trauma-informed approach, it is equally, if not more so important, to make sure that we are supporting our staff in a trauma-informed way. So today, we're going to be focusing on the police. And I'm really pleased to be joined today by Mark Jackson, who is the TRIM Co-Ordinator. And we'll explain what that means in a bit more detail in a moment, from the Avon Somerset Police. So, Mark, thank you for joining me today.
Good morning, Steve.
Great stuff. Well, we'll sort of get into it if we can, but I think just to kind of provide a bit of a context here around the needs around that need to have that trauma-informed approach. I sort of pulled out some statistics to kind of look at, which I think when I read them, I kind of realised what a huge kind of aspect this is, because often when we think about the police, quite often in the public mind, you think about those public-facing officers, those bobbies on the beat, uniformed officers, responders, and obviously people kind of appreciate some of the situations they have to respond to. But that wider context within the police of those kind of less seen officers, I guess, and detectives who I think a lot of people don't have, understandably, an understanding of the breadth of the work they do and the trauma that's involved with that. And I was interviewing an officer recently from the Internet Child Abuse team, and just that reality of actually what they are having to do on a day-to-day basis. And when we think about the road traffic collisions that take place, somebody has to be there to be dealing with these things. And just kind of pulling out some of the statistics around this. And this is statistics I had from 2022 to 2023. And at that reporting period, we had a record 13,500 police officers nationally signed off that previous year due to distress and anxiety or PTSD, which was up by 80% from just 10 years before that. And I believe within the Avon and Somerset Police region for that previous year, just within Avon and Somerset alone, we had 275 officers signed off for mental health related issues here, which is kind of it's a record nationally. And so it's a really kind of important area that we need to think about. So Mark, I've probably talked quite enough about this already, but I thought it was important just to set the scene. So in terms of your role then, would you be able to kind of explain to us sort of what your role is and why it's important?
Yeah, of course. I mean, gosh, thinking back, it's about 10 years ago that one of the kind of senior leaders within our human resources department actually was very familiar with this TRIM program, which was used by a number of other forces. So she successfully introduced it into Avon Somerset. And at the time, I was actually just about to retire as a police officer, having completed 30 years of service. And I took on that role. And the role really at that time was to develop the program, because the idea of tackling mental health within the police service, especially frontline officers, was a big stigma barrier. So there was a lot of work to do around marketing, trying to sell it. And I suppose in a way, having worked as a cop myself, and was fairly well known, especially in the north of the force. It did make that journey a little bit easier in terms of kind of raising awareness and getting people to try and engage with the service.
Before we sort of get into sort of some of the wider aspects of the topic, you mentioned sort of trim there. For anybody who doesn't know trim, would you be able to explain sort of what trim is?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I guess probably the best way of describing it is to go back to where it came from, and it actually originated in following the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, and it developed around the Royal Marines, because what was happening was a lot of the servicemen and women were going into conflict situations. They were exposed to some extreme trauma. Of course, we're talking about things which are probably well and above what we would experience in the emergency services. But a growing number of the Marines and support teams were struggling to process what they'd experienced. And you don't think about that with the Royal Marines, do you? Because this is what they're trained to do. They're highly trained professionals, and you expect them to be able to kind of work through this and work effectively. But a larger number were struggling. And it reached the extent that the Ministry of Defence were actually taken to court. It was a class action where they asked the question that, is it right that we should send our men and women into battle for us, but we don't look after their mental health? And the judgment will surprise you, Steve, that the judgment was, well, no, actually, a Royal Marine's job is to fight and win wars, and the mental health consideration really isn't a part of it.
Okay.
But they did say that they should try and find a way of monitoring how well people were recovering after exposure, identify those that were at high risk of going on to suffer from long-term disorders, and then do something about it before it turned into something like PTSD, for instance. So the process was designed by military, some guys from the Army, a Royal Marine captain actually at the time, and they designed this program, which they hit on absolute goldmine, because it's brilliant. It hasn't been changed in all these years. And it's the same process used throughout many of the police services and fire and rescue services in the UK, and a couple of ambulance services. And the idea really is to find those people who've been exposed to trauma, ask them whether they would like to engage with the trim process. And if they do, then they would sit down with a trained practitioner for about an hour, who will ask them a series of questions, and the answers to those questions give an indication about your risk factors in terms of how likely you are to go on to suffer from long-term disorder. And when we find people who are high risk, and of the people we see, we're talking about maybe 13-14% of the ones we see, we then refer them for some intensive and early treatment interventions, which reduce the risk of them then going to suffer from disorder. So the quicker you get in there, start treating, the less likely they are to suffer from longer term problems. So that's the principles around TRIM. It's an assessment process. Within Avon Somerset, it's completely confidential. We don't write anything down. And in fact, and we are quite unique with this, is we don't tell anybody that person has chosen to have an assessment. So their boss doesn't know, occupational health don't know. In fact, the only person that knows is them and their practitioner, and me as the coordinator. If they choose to tell somebody, that's up to them, but we actually keep it between ourselves.
Okay. Well, can I ask why that is?
It's because a lot of clients, when they're talking about what their stressors are, it's not just about what they're exposed to, Steve. Sometimes there's additional stress from their line management. So in terms of the leadership within the organization, it's developing, it's growing, it's turning into something a little bit more trauma-informed. But actually, there are still leaders out there who add to the stress of our client. And some of them will say, if I have trim, will my boss need to know? And we can say, no, they don't. We can do this completely in secret. And I think for some people, that has been the key factor which has prompted them to engage with the service, because it's a difficult decision in the police service, because it's not the way we used to do things. You didn't recognize your own mental health. You just got on with it.
Yeah.
Whereas now what we're trying to do is instill in people, said, no, do something about it, because you're going to be a healthier, happier person. And actually, in the context of some of those figures that you provided, they're more likely not to be off long-term sick, because they will be they more likely to be well following their exposure.
Mm. And you mentioned a minute ago about stigma around mental health, and I think within the police, but to be fair, I think a lot of institutions, there was that kind of thing. You man up, get on with it. It's what you're here to do. Just crack on with it. And we know actually that trauma and incidents affect everybody equally, and no matter what part of life you are, we are human beings and we are affected by these things. And that kind of old stiff upper lip and man up and get on with it is it doesn't work. It's not effective and does affect people's mental health. And do you find, is that something that's changing, has changed, or is changing over time? Or
yeah, it is. I mean, I suppose for all of my service, all of the things you've said applied, and it kind of, in context, it's sort of, well, what did you expect during the police service? That's what we do. Should be no surprise to you. And what we're finding now is, because we're going through large levels of recruitment of new officers, I actually welcome them in their first week and give them a presentation about TRIM. And of course, these new people in the organisation are like sponges. They will accept whatever culture is delivered to them.
Yeah.
And when they see me in a prime spot in that first week, saying, yeah, this is what the police service is about. We know we embrace the fact that a workforce will go through times which are difficult. This is how you deal with it. This is what we do. And then as a result of that, what I'm finding is a lot of these new students say, yeah, I'll have TRIM, no problem. Yeah, let's do it. However, you get to some of the more long-serving members of staff, and it's not just police officers, it's everybody in the organisation. They are much more reluctant. And I know if they will engage, they will really appreciate that engagement. And I know that because every couple of years I survey everybody who's used the service. And it's an anonymous survey, and they do have the opportunity to put in written comments. And one of the comments I see the most, Steve, is, this was amazing. I've always seen your emails and ignored them. I didn't think I needed this. Now I've had it. I wish I'd accepted it years ago. So I think it's refreshing to read that. And those people then become advocates for the service. So when they see colleagues struggling, and you talked a little about the roads policing unit and their constant exposure to fatal collisions, where they're having to deal with not only the deceased but their families and relatives as well. They've been quite hard to engage with in terms of this, because they tend to be longer serving. But where people have used the service, they're telling colleagues, you know what, when you get your message from Mark, just accept it, please do it. And I've also trained up a number of specialist operations staff. These are firearms guys, traffic guys, to become practitioners, because they then behave as role models in the workplace. And I've deliberately actually gone for people who probably occupy that space that we would think about the old time cops, rock hard, nothing frightens them. And I said, well, if you're a practitioner and they see that you're an advocate of it, they'll say, well, if it's all right for you, it's probably going to be all right for me. And that is working, Steve. That's
good. No, it's really good to hear. And it's interesting you mentioned about the recruitment of new police officers, and obviously that on a national basis has been a huge re-recruitment of officers. And it's good to hear that sort of being an opportunity for culture change, I guess, and like I say, getting those young officers in and hopefully over time removing that stigma. And like you say, it's not just within the police force; it's right the way across the society in terms of having stigma around mental health. But that sounds really positive that there is that change. And it was interesting as well. You sort of mentioned actually those who have taken part in the program then coming back to say, actually, I didn't think I needed it, but actually it was massively helpful. And again, looking at statistically, I think 1 in 5 police officers in the UK have symptoms consistent with PTSD or complex PTSD. But the majority of those aren't even aware of it themselves, aren't aware of the symptoms of it. So be able to kind of offer that and be picked up, and then people
Yeah.
see the benefit is brilliant.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And you wouldn't really find a frontline officer, whether that's a police officer, a PCSO, or someone who works in the control room, who really is at the front line of this stuff. You'd struggle to find one who don't have elements of incidents in the past which haven't been fully processed. And of course, complex PTSD is about this build-up of lots of different things all leaving a little mark in your brain, and eventually it becomes so much of it becomes overwhelming and then can cause some of these significant symptoms. So I'm under no illusion that there are plenty of colleagues who are working, some of them working not particularly well, who could get some support and treatment around this, if they would engage with the TRIM process.
Can I ask, in terms of the sort of mental health needs for officers that you see, did you see a rise during the sort of pandemic period, and have you sort of seen a legacy from that afterwards? Because obviously it was a time of huge anxiety for everybody, I think, and it's easy to forget now. We kind of lose that context of where we were at that point in time. But actually, in the early days of the pandemic, we were looking at potentially millions of people dying, half the workforce being out at any point in time in illness, people on ventilators. Yeah. I think we forget that context of that. And obviously, with officers, there wasn't an option just to go, well, we'll just stop policing. Then we'll just stay at home and convalesce like everybody else is. But actually, still very much that expectation on emergency services to you've got to carry on your job. So did you see a kind of a rise in sort of mental health needs around that time? And
no, we didn't actually, and we'd done some contingency planning work around this about where it may go, because as you'll remember, Steve, at the time nobody knew where this was going to end up.
No.
We were thinking about mass mortuaries and some horrendous stuff that we were planning for. And you're quite right, all of our frontline staff, who the majority of people who use the service, in fairness. So although it's available to everybody, not everybody is as high risk as those that work frontline. But most of them were still coming to work as normal. They weren't working from home. There was a slight difference in the profile of incidents. So the number of fatal collisions dropped dramatically because no one was on the road, Steve.
Yeah.
But some of the other things that were traumatic, like hangings, child deaths, and bits and pieces like that still continued. So consistently, what we've seen since we started in 2014 is every year we've seen more and more people engaging with the TRIM service, and it has increased year on year. Last year was our biggest. This year will be bigger again in terms of number of people we see. Over the pandemic, there was no change in that gradual rise. There wasn't a blip in there, but I think the profile of the exposure changed slightly, but not necessarily related to the mental effects of the pandemic.
Yeah, okay, that's good to hear. But it's I'm thinking as well from what you've been saying. I guess there's kind of two aspects to this, isn't it? Well, one, you sort of talked about that gradual build-up of trauma over time, from maybe sort of smaller incidents that take place. But then also you have these large incidents that take place, and you mentioned Afghanistan at the start, and officers wouldn't kind of experience anything like that. But actually, when we think about things like the Ariana Grande shootings and what have you, actually these are incidents that appear usually out of nowhere, and can be hugely traumatic. So we've got these sort of big trigger incidents, and then we've also got these kind of this sort of slow build up of trauma. In terms of the work you do, does it kind of deal with both, or is it more kind of one or the other?
Well, the system we operate is quite labour intensive, and that's kind of why my role is here. Is generally the police service are not particularly good at help-seeking behaviours. So if you have posters around a station or information on intranet, generally people won't do that. So what we've actually done is I look at what's been happening. So I've looked at the calls from the last 24 hours, identified those that are likely to be traumatic for somebody, find out who did what, and then send them an offer.
So that proactive approach.
Yeah. The police service kind of traditionally have been very poor at help-seeking behaviour. So the main part of my role actually is looking at what has happened operationally in the last 24 hours, identify those incidents which are likely to be traumatic to somebody, identify who did what, and then physically send them an offer in an email.
Yeah.
So they will come to work and said, you were involved in this. Would you like the support of TRIM? And it carries some information, some little voting buttons. So they just have to click a button saying, yes, please. Somebody actually did that this morning from a job from yesterday. And that makes it really easy for somebody to get help, because the second they've clicked on that button, I will then find a suitable practitioner, look at when they're available, get those two people together. And I need to get them assessed between 3 days after the incident and 7 days after the incident. So it's quite a short window of time. So really, by clicking a button, it all happens for you. Whereas I think reading literature, watching videos is something we're not good at. People just don't find the time in the day to do that.
Yeah.
But what does happen, and one of the questions, Steve, in there is about previous traumatic incidents. So there are 10 questions. That's one of them. Quite often what we will find is the incident that they've accepted the offer for, which is recent, was just the prompt they needed to get some help. And what we end up talking about is the things that maybe have happened over the years, either within the police service or in their personal lives, or even before they joined the service. And we can then pick up those clients who actually are suffering from more of the complex PTSD symptoms. So the bulk of it is directed towards what's just happened, but we do try and identify those that have the longer term impact.
Yeah, no, it's really good to hear about that proactive approach to things, because like you say, quite often we can just adopt we'll wait until the phone rings and then we'll respond to that.
Yes.
And it's really good to hear that proactive approach to supporting officers, because I think that's really important. And often we just kind of wait for the phone to ring and answer it and then respond to it. So in terms of that sort of gradual build up we talked about, and you sort of talked about looking through logs and identifying any incidents, is there sort of wider responses in place for officers for that sort of more sort of gradual build up? I guess that more sort of over time, that sort of more sort of well-being support that you're aware of?
Yeah, I mean, there's a good range of services available to all staff members, really. We have a group of individuals called mental health first aiders who have probably more detailed knowledge about conditions than TRIM practitioners do. And they're available to anybody who kind of wants to have some support over a longer period of time. And we also have a very resilient service within occupational health, because the treatments for the PTSD or complex PTSD or any developing long-term disorder sit around two treatments which we can provide in-house. One of them is cognitive behavioral therapy, and the other one is called EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing. So we have 6 professionals employed by us who deal with all clients who are referred to them. And they don't all come through TRIM. So a line manager, for instance, who is concerned about one of their staff members who may not want to engage with TRIM, or is struggling with something that happened a long time ago, so there's no recent trigger incident that we would get involved in, they can also refer them into that same service. So there are a number of routes into professional support. And we also have an external provider for counselling services, which is widely advertised throughout the force, and people can just ring them themselves and they just have that conversation with that organisation. And they have access to trained counsellors 24/7. So there's some fairly solid provision throughout the organisation. But I suppose if you asked an officer what is the main thing, they would say trim, because trim is in their face. And, some of the very proactive people might have 2 or 3 offers a day from me because they're constantly being exposed to things.
Yeah.
And I don't apologize for the excessive emails they get, because I hope that one day they'll go, okay, I'm just going to give it a go, because I just want to see what this thing is.
just want Mark to stop hassling me.
Yeah. So some people do say, I've had so many of these. I just want to give it a go to see what it's all about. And of course, they're then quite surprised. And even if they don't need any ongoing support, they then have a good idea about how this thing sits. And I think what surprises most people is when you talk about mental health, you think about treatments, you think about something more like a counselling type of thing, which does put some people off. But what they realise is just talking to a colleague who is taking them through a clearly specified route of a conversation. It might not feel like that when you're talking to somebody, but it is a very clear route we're following. And all they're doing is doing an assessment. And at the end of it, and I think this is the biggest relief for clients, is you're explaining why they are reacting in this way. And the 2 things that people take from the assessment is, 1, a good opportunity to talk openly and honestly how they've been affected, knowing it's not going to go any further. And secondly, understanding that what's happened to them is a normal reaction to an abnormal event. And when you start to normalize it, people start thinking, oh, okay, well, I didn't realize that. That's really helpful to understand that actually this has happened before. It's going to happen again. It's just a normal recovery process that people go through.
And sometimes I think with a lot of things, just knowing helps massively. Just understanding better, isn't it?
Yes. And what we find probably the most productive thing is explaining what's happening in the brain, why it causes these reactions. And of course, people look at you and go, oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know I understand that, And I can apply that to myself, if I'm having a stressful situation that stops me from sleeping at night, I can just tell myself why this is happening and how long it takes to go away, and sure enough it does. So it is really helpful just having that knowledge and information.
Yeah, no, thank you. And are you able to kind of talk us through the TRIM model? So for anybody that's not aware, so TRIM stands for trauma risk
management. That's right, yeah.
And that's interesting actually, because often when we think about risk management, we think about risk assessment, we think about identifying risk, but actually from what you said earlier, am I right in thinking it's more about identifying the risk of kind of developing some severe mental health needs?
Sure, yeah. And I think what's really key here is that people who get a reaction to a traumatic incident, these first few days are pretty horrible, actually. Your body just does all these strange things. But what we do know is that most of that does happen in the first 3 days, and people dramatically change after that, and they go through a much slower paced recovery, but the horrible stuff tends to have faded. And I said to you earlier, we won't assess somebody until 3 days has passed. That's the reason why. Because we need all of that noise to have disappeared and start to establish which are the things that haven't gone and how much of it hasn't gone, and that will indicate whether somebody is going into high risk. So it might be useful just to talk through what your brain
the
does.
Actual process.
Okay. So what tends to happen is, once you get this exposure, your brain has got all of this unprocessed information. And actually, if you think about somebody who's working at the front line and has actually seen this thing, whatever it is, or experienced it, if you look at people who perhaps work in the control room who are just listening to it, the effect on them is the same, because what they do is they fill in the gaps and they create images of what they think it looks like. So there is really no difference in terms of the effect. So what your brain now has to do, it has to move this information. So it sits in the part of your brain, your psychological memory, and it gradually moves it across your brain and puts it into your library, your objective memory, where everything is historical. You think about it, it's something that happened in the past and it doesn't affect you anymore. So for this bigger stuff, your brain is working really hard at doing this, and it will process. It processes whether you're sleeping or you're awake, and it doesn't respect the fact that you're tired. And that's why most of us, when we've got stuff to process, we struggle to sleep. And it's the most common thing. People will go to bed, they're tired, and all they can do is think about this incident. It's very intrusive, and all that's happening is your brain is just working on this information. So what I say to people is, look, there's nothing you can do about this inability to sleep. But what you can be reassured about is in normal recovery, after 3 days, things start to go back to normal.
I think there's a risk with that, isn't there, where if somebody's unable to sleep and they're struggling with it, they then might be turning to alcohol to go, well, I'll have some drinks and that'll get me to sleep. And then you're in this kind of cycle, aren't you?
Sure. We'll come back to alcohol if you may, actually, about the impact of that. So associated with the not sleeping is the inability to concentrate. So what people tend to find, and if I get the opportunity of talking to somebody before they've actually gone home after the incident, I said, look, really, really focus on your driving, because you will be the worst driver, because you won't be able to think about what you're doing, because your brain is putting all its energy into processing. So when it comes to driving or having a conversation with a family member or a colleague, or even just doing your job, you find it incredibly difficult, and tasks take 3 or 4 times longer than normal. Because your brain is saying to you, I am really busy at the moment processing. You're now asking me to do something else. And your brain says, I can't actually fit any more into this. It's just not going to happen. But again, because the recovery rate over 3 days is rapid in normal recovery, people's concentration tends to come back fairly quickly afterwards. And the third thing, which is incredibly common, is people get irritable.
Yep.
And Steve, I'm sure you seem a very calm person, but maybe I
try, but not always.
Even you, under a bit of stress and pressure, might become irritable. And the reason we do that is because our brain is processing using a lot of brain capacity, and actually, what it can do is it can grab capacity from another part of your brain which controls your temperament. So people that are normally very mild-mannered and calm suddenly get a bit grisly for a few days. But again, the recovery is very quick. And what I tend to say to people is, look, you're probably going to be grumpy. It's worth telling people around you are, and it's to do with what you've experienced at work. It's nothing to do with what they've done. And that can save you having unnecessary problems at home later on. Just allow yourself the space to kind of go through recovery. You mentioned alcohol, which is really interesting. And I would reflect back to kind of what the Royal Marines discovered, actually, when they were trying to process traumatic exposure. A lot of them did just what you said. They drank, and they drank a lot. And the effect it had on them was it seemed to stop that painful processing physiological reaction. And as long as they kept drinking, they could avoid the unpleasantness. But all it actually did, it paused processing. So years later, when some of them got some help around their alcohol problems, stopped drinking, what happened? The pause button was released. They processed what had happened all those years before, and they ended up getting PTSD. So a key message really is, if you are getting a reaction from traumatic exposure, is to avoid drinking alcohol for 3 days. And then as things start to go back to normal, just to drink in moderation for the rest of the month. So I think the brain processes are really interesting, but when you go through this and somebody explains it to you, you think, it really does make sense. And of course, what especially police officers is they like facts and information. They like it to be scientific. So they can relate to that. And sure enough, most people do recover by themselves, and they do follow that pattern of recovery, and they start to go back to normal very quickly.
It's good. And like you say, when we can break it down in a very clear way, like you've just done, actually, it makes a lot of sense. It's very logical. And like I say, just kind of knowing, okay, yeah, this is what is going to happen to me or happening to me, and this is the reason why. And I had to say though, when you were saying about when you drive home, you're probably going to be the worst driver ever, and you might be a bit sort of tetchy. I'm just thinking, so be aware for your colleagues when you're driving down the M5 and they pull you over for bad driving. Don't be grumpy with them.
Exactly. Do you know? And interestingly, I think that does link well into the kind of trauma-informed approach that my trim practitioners have really good knowledge about this, and they do understand reactions. So when those that are frontline are dealing with members of the public, they're dealing with perpetrators, they're dealing with victims, they're dealing with witnesses, they will also get those same reactions. So they have more understanding about why they're behaving in the way that they are. And they can give them some reassurance and support around that and perhaps deal with them in a slightly different way. So I think in terms of our trauma-informed journey, the TRIM team, my practitioners, are already at the end of that journey because they do really understand this about the way people are affected by historical trauma as well, and about the impact that might have on them. So TRIM does link very neatly into our journey about becoming a trauma-informed organisation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know Sarah Cruz is kind of very much driving for the Avon Somerset Police for within, I think, next 3-4 years to become a fully trauma-informed organisation, which people often don't think about the police in that kind of, kind of picture of being a trauma-informed organisation. But like I say, from top to bottom, if we're supporting officers, we're supporting not just officers, but all staff, and it's right the way throughout the organisation. It's in our policies, it's in our procedures, and it's the way that we interact and understand our work with the public.
Yeah.
It goes right the way through, doesn't it?
It does. And I think, if people recognize these symptoms and approach them in the right way, they're probably going to get a much better response from whichever member of the public they're dealing with. Because if there is that recognition of, a traumatic response to something, then they can kind of show some understanding, perhaps give people a little bit more time to recover before they do their engagement in terms of perhaps statement taking or, dealing with some of the later after services. Given that recovery time, they will get a better response. But the mission really is to bring the whole organisation up to the standard of my TRIM team, really, and get that knowledge embedded. And it will take a little bit of time.
So are you able to kind of actually sort of talk us through what the sort of TRIM process would look like? So obviously you sort of reach out, you have somebody contact you to say, yes, I would like this.
Yeah.
Is it always kind of face to face? Is it online? And can you kind of talk us through?
Yeah, of course.
Process?
So I send out my offers, and I kind of know which incidents are likely to promote a response. And somebody goes, yes, please, I'd like TRIM. So what I will ask them is, I'll ask them for a contact number. I'll ask them whether they mind who they see, and I'll ask them whether they would prefer face-to-face or Teams. Now, when I ask them whether they mind who they see, I think that's really important, because although the majority of people will say, really don't mind, I've worked really hard to make sure that my team of about 80 people, these are all people who have full-time jobs within the organisation, or special constables who are volunteers, and they do it on top of their day job. But I've got a very diverse team. So whatever the reason is you're asking for TRIM, you have got some options about the right person for you. And if people say, I don't mind, but I think a certain person would be ideal for them, I will go to that person, see if I can get them to engage. So once I have that information, I will then send a message out to all of the practitioners describing what the incident is for that client, when they're available, and their location. And most people do have face-to-face rather than Teams. And then whoever thinks they can fit that availability will then contact me and says, I can do it. And it's only that person I will identify who that person is. So the confidentiality side is really important. They will then contact the client and then work out a good time to meet up. And then they will carry out that process of doing the assessment. So most assessments will show that those clients are not high risk. So they're likely to recover all by themselves, which is great. And then what the practitioner will do is they will check in on them in about a month's time, just to make sure they've gone through the full cycle of recovery, which is 28 days max. And then after that, they end the process. However, if we identify somebody either at that first meeting or second meeting who is high risk, we then said, we recommend we refer you to occupational health for some specialist treatment. Do you consent? So the client always remains in control. Most of them will say, yes, please. And then we refer them to occupational health. They no longer remain in the TRIM program because they're then a patient of OHU, and they will contact them and they will start treatment as soon as they possibly can, just to make sure they've lowered the risk of them going on to suffer from long-term disorder. So that's in a nutshell. That's how it works. We saw 336 people last year.
Okay.
So far this year, we're already on about 150.
Right.
And that's just in 4 months. So it's probably going to be a bumpy year again. But we had a very difficult start to the year with some fairly horrific murders and some involving children as well, which was very unpleasant.
And obviously you have the sort of the formal trim model that you talked about, and we sort of talked about understanding some of those the kind of responses, the body responses.
Yes.
Are you able to sort of give any sort of top tips to anybody broadly, that's not part of the police force here, around kind of coping with trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that statement I made earlier, that this is your body's normal reaction to an abnormal event, is really important, because this is just what bodies do. Once we embrace the fact that 3 days are going to be pretty unpleasant, but there are things you can do in those 3 days which will make that journey a little bit easier for you. And the 4 tips are, as I mentioned before, is try to avoid drinking alcohol for the first 3 days. And then after those first 3 days, people who go through normal recovery, which is most people, will start to feel better. And they should only drink in moderation for the rest of the 28-day cycle, just to allow their brain a clear passage through. The second one, which I mentioned also, was around irritability. And this is mentioning to people around you, you're probably going to be grumpy. Chances are you're going to be, irrespective of how calm you are normally. It reassures those people around you. It's nothing they've done. They understand. They'll give you the space and allow you to kind of have that 3 days of recovery. The next one is about talking about the effect it's had on you. And it's about having somebody that you can trust to talk openly, honestly about the way you've been affected. Quite often that's somebody outside the organisation. But talking about it helps you go through the process much quicker. So your brain's cogs turn a bit quicker, you talking about it. And I say, look, if people really care about you, they're not going to care about the fact you're boring them to death by telling them the same thing over and over again. But it is helping you. So encourage people to do that. And the fourth one is a real tricky one, Steve. This is people usually have a happy place to go in terms of what they do in their spare time they enjoy, whether it's playing tennis, going for a run, cycling, baking cakes, whatever it is. But people's common reaction after they've been affected by trauma is they lose interest in that activity, quite often because they're just exhausted and they just don't want to do anything. But actually, the act of making yourself do that activity still produces the same effect it would in normal times. So it still releases chemicals in your brain which make you feel happy. It distracts your thoughts from unpleasant thoughts. And actually, your brain can process things much more quickly if you're happy. So engaging those activities is a really good thing to do, especially in those first 3 days, just to kind of help move things through. And by doing that, you can be fairly sure that within those 3 days, you'll get the recovery. So people who don't do that might have a slightly longer recovery period. So that's the advice I give to my guys, and generally people find that works.
I'm just thinking the sort of mental tick list as you're sort of going through those of some of the sort of what I would think of as kind of typical responses to trauma, which would be to shut yourself away, have a drink, don't go out and socialize, do things, or pretty much the polar opposite of what you've just talked about. Exactly. Not talk about things, sort of shut down a little bit.
And men, it won't surprise you, Steve, are much worse at this than women. Women are generally much more comfortable talking about it. Men really struggle. However, when you look at the profile of people who we see, it's about 50-50, about half men, half women. Right. So the people who are actually reaching out for help are 50-50, as you would expect. But in terms of people self-helping, especially around the talking, women tend to be much better.
You do see that reflected in things like suicide rates, which are
middle-aged men.
Middle-aged men, big spike, isn't it?
Absolutely right. Yeah,
and it's really, really, really interesting to kind of talk through this and sort of understand. And say, I think it's an area that people often don't think about when we think about the police or other services, about that support that is put in place in the background, which is so important. You mentioned there, we mentioned earlier about the Avon Somerset Police's aim to become a trauma-informed organisation, and things have clearly developed quite a lot already over the last decade or more. Is there anything sort of else in the pipeline that you're sort of working on or aware of, or anything your sort of wish list of what you'd want to see?
Yeah, there's a lot going on, really. And I think what I've kind of recognised the more years I spend with Avon Somerset Police is that some of these changes are generational. You can manipulate the minds of some of the old school, but you can't necessarily change them completely. And one of my very treasured trim practitioners, who also teaches the trim course, is involved in our leadership program. So she designs the leadership training for all our sergeants, inspectors, etc., and civilian managers. And she has laced the lessons from trim into all of that learning. So as people start going through those particular parts of their own CPD and personal development, they're learning more about being good managers in terms of recognizing some of these signs and symptoms. One of the products that was rolled out recently, which she's also helping to roll out, is a thing called the diffusion process. So it's all the key elements of trim, but it's in a interactive document which sergeants and inspectors can grab immediately after an incident and go through that with their staff before they go home. So it's giving some of those key messages.
Yeah.
It talks a little bit about trim, and it talks a little bit around, that mental health safety and some of the things that they can engage with, and gives them lots of online resources if they need to kind of enhance that. And within the trauma-informed program, we've now got some really capable volunteers within the organisation to become super trained in terms of rolling this out to the majority of departments within the organisation to kind of bring them up to the kind of level that trim practitioners are. So there are some really proactive steps moving forward. And although the end of that trauma-informed journey might be years, the bulk of the activity is happening in the next few months, actually. So they are really getting on with this. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is when people, usually due to a change of role, say, I can't be a trim practitioner, I'm really sorry, I have to leave. I said, you're not really leaving. You might not be seeing clients now, but you've got the knowledge, you're an advocate for trim, that you can still give that support in your new role. And then I train more people. And in fact, next month, I'm training another 16 people. So the more and more people I train, I'm putting through that intensive program of learning about trauma response and how to best support it.
Slowly filtering out across the whole organisation.
It does take time, and it'll take beyond my time.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Mark, thank you so much for that. It's been really, really fascinating to kind of talk to you and understand all the work that you do and the force as a whole sort of is undertaking as we speak. And so it's often an area that I think historically has been overlooked a lot in terms of supporting staff. We just kind of expect people just to crack on with it and keep going, which say isn't beneficial for them or for clients they work with. So thank you very much. Much appreciated. And it'd be great at some point sort of come back, and if you've got more things in the pipeline, more things being developed, it'll be great to find out about them. So yeah, anytime. Fantastic. Well, Mark, thank you so much.
No worries, Steve. Thank you.
Take care, and we'll speak again soon.
Okay, bye.
Take care. Bye. As always, if you'd like to find out more details on the topics discussed in today's episode, go to the SSCP website at somersetsafeguardingchildren.org.uk or by following any of the links in the episode description. If you enjoyed listening to the ThePPod, we'd really appreciate it if you took the time to follow or subscribe to us on your chosen platform, or even better, leave us a review to let other people know about it. It really does help to spread the word. And talking about spreading the word, don't forget to tell other people about it and encourage them to join us here as well. If you have any questions or comments arising from today's episode, or would like to be involved in future episodes, we'd love you to get in touch with us at theppod@somerset.gov.uk. Once again, I'd like to give a huge thank you to my guest today, Mark Jackson, Trim Co-Ordinator from the Avon Somerset Police. And as always, I'd like to thank you for listening. My name is Steve Maccabee, and I'm the Training Manager for the Somerset Safeguarding Children Partnership. And I look forward to you joining us again next time at the ThePPod.
Let's work together to help keep children safe.